The federal rules.
Sushi dinner.
Okay, great. Thank you all so much for coming to the first event of Public Interest Week and a conversation that could not be more timely: abortion access and economic justice, Dobbs, SB8, and beyond. My name is Hannah Rosenfeld. I'm one of the co-chairs of If When How. We want to thank TPIC for supporting this event, as well as our friends at ACS and BALSA for co-sponsoring. This is a conversation centered around reproductive justice, which is a movement started and led by Black women to ensure the personal autonomy of all people to have the children they want to have in safe, sustainable communities. Our discussion today, which is focused on the economic challenges of obtaining abortion care, is informed by this framework and extends beyond the idea of choice, and instead focuses on the access that people have to abortion services and how that access is restricted by barriers that correspond to intersecting identities and income status. We're thrilled to be joined by our distinguished speakers, each of whom brings a unique perspective to this conversation. Our moderator today is Professor Serena Mayeri, a professor of law and history here at Penn Law. Professor Mayeri teaches courses in family law, employment discrimination, gender in the law, and legal history, and her scholarship focuses on the historical impacts of social movements on legal and constitutional change. She's also co-authored amicus briefs in cases including Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health Organization, Bostock v. Clayton County, and Trump v. Hawaii. Marcia Jones is the co-founder and executive director of the AFIA Center, the only reproductive justice organization in North Texas, founded and directed by Black women. She is a national grassroots organizer, community mobilizer, professional speaker, and health educator with a commitment to transforming women and girls' lives. Professor Gonzalez is an associate professor at Occidental College and a senior scholar at Georgetown Law's Center on Poverty and Inequality. Her work focuses on civil and human rights, the school-to-prison pipeline, race, gender inequality, and juvenile justice. And at Georgetown Law, she leads national research on restorative justice outcomes, implementation, practice, and policy. Israel Cook is a state legislative fellow at the Center for Reproductive Rights. Israel is responsible for tracking and analyzing reproductive rights legislation in all 50 states and Washington, D.C. And we are especially excited to have Israel join us today as the Center for Reproductive Rights is part of the teams arguing both Dobbs v. Jackson and the SB8 challenges, which were argued at the Supreme Court this morning. And before we get started, just a few logistical things. So to submit a question virtually, please use the Q&A feature found on the ribbon at the bottom of the window. And in-person attendees, paper was just passed out, and we will collect that before the Q&A. And also, I just want to say, for those of you in the room, if you could just silence all your devices, and just a reminder that there are microphones around the room. So just if we could keep our voices to a minimum while our speakers are speaking. We're recording this lecture today, and the recording will be sent out to the attendees. And if you are seeking CLE credit for today's event, please note that CLE passwords will be announced twice per hour. So write down these passwords and enter them on your digital evaluation form once the event is over. The evaluation form is mandatory for both in-person and virtual attendees seeking credit in order to receive CLE. The link to the digital evaluation form was emailed to you in your confirmation email. If you didn't receive the email, or if you're on the webinar, please find the link to the evaluation form in the chat, or if you are in person, you can scan the QR code upon the conclusion of this event right outside the classroom. And these passwords will just tell us how long you attended. So the first password is table. Okay, so without further ado, I will hand it over to Professor Mayeri to get started. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna, and thank you all for coming. I'm really honored to be moderating this very distinguished panel today. Our guests are joining us remotely, and we're really thrilled to have each of them here with us today. What I thought I would start out by doing is just giving an overview of, very brief overview of the cases that are before the Supreme Court right now, just to frame the discussion. and then we'll jump right into our conversation with our speakers. So today, this morning, in fact, there were two cases argued before the U.S. Supreme Court, both challenges to the Texas law SB8, which, as you may know, prohibits abortions starting around the 6th week of pregnancy, which is something that a number of states around the country have done. What's different, as you probably know, about the Texas law is that enforcement is solely in the hands of private parties rather than of state officials. The law allows anyone to bring a lawsuit in state court against anyone who performs or abets an abortion, and to receive $10,000 in damages along with costs and attorney's fees. So the two cases that were heard this morning, one is coming from state court, Whole Women's Health versus Jackson. In that case, abortion providers had sued a state judge and a county clerk, as well as several other state officials, to enjoin them from participating in enforcement of SB8 by hearing cases brought under its auspices. This is the case which a closely divided court declined to prevent the law from going into effect in August. And then the second case, U.S. versus Texas, was filed by the Biden administration directly against the state of Texas in early September, seeking to enjoin enforcement again. A federal district court issued a very long opinion granting that injunction, but it was then voided by the Fifth Circuit, and eventually the Supreme Court agreed to hear the case. And these cases are being argued, of course, on this very expedited calendar. And then the other case we're going to be hearing to some degree about today is Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization, which will be argued a month from today on December 1st. And that's the challenge to Mississippi's near total ban on abortions after 15 weeks of gestation. And it really more directly puts before the court the question of whether Roe versus Wade and Planned Parenthood versus Casey are still good law. I do want to emphasize, we're going to be talking today about the practical effects that have already occurred from the Texas law as it's been in effect for a couple of months now. And while the questions before the Supreme Court today seem largely procedural, of course they have these incredible substantive impacts and may also give us some clues as to how the justices are thinking about the substance of the law in this area. Okay, so the part we've been waiting for is to hear from our speakers. And I can see them here on my screen, and hopefully you can see them up here. So let's get started. So I thought we might start by asking you each come to this topic from different vantage points. And I'm curious to hear from each of your perspectives, what is concerning to you about these cases and how the Supreme Court in particular weighs in on the right to abortion. And we're starting out with this question that's really about the cases, and I hope then we'll move into talking more concretely about the experiences on the ground of people who are affected by these and other laws. So I thought maybe Israel Cook might begin for us with this question about the Supreme Court's intervention in these cases.
Yes, thank you for having me. Again, my name is Israel. I use she, her pronouns. I'm at the Center for Reproductive Rights. And just kind of a note, I have a cat and I live in New York. So if you hear some noises, I really apologize. So, being in front of the Supreme Court on an abortion rights case is not new. And the Center has litigated and won cases at the Supreme Court as recently as 2016 and 2020. And the court has continually reaffirmed the right to abortion over almost 50 years, while the composition of the court has changed many times. However, what has changed most recently is this ideological balance of the Supreme Court after President Trump appointed 3 justices to the court during his presidency, shifting the balance of the court from a 5-4 split in support of abortion rights to a hostile 6-3. And so what we're really seeing is at this time that is really concerning is that the court has, hasn't heard a pre-viability challenge in a really long time. And it's kind of unprecedented. And it's why is the court hearing this challenge now? And also, I think this really implicates the liberty doctrine and the privacy rights. So if the court is willing to hear this challenge and overturn Roe, they're really, they could potentially start challenging other rights that we find like within this liberty doctrine are related to like marriage and contraception, Obergefell and people's private, sex lives and things like that. And so it is very concerning right now. And I can dig further, but I want the other panelists to have a chance to speak.
Thank you so much. Ms. Jones, would you like to go next?
Good. I believe it's morning. Well, it's morning in Texas, so good morning, everyone. And yes, I'm Marcia Jones, and I am the executive director of the Afia Center in Dallas, Texas. And when I think about what Israel, and my pronouns are she and her, what Israel was saying made me think about something that happened when you're talking about losing liberty. So I'm a little older, right? So I remember years and years and years ago, hearing that you couldn't buy like Playboy magazines and stuff like that. They had to be in a brown package. Like you had to cover them. I remember when they started asking you to do that. Now I wasn't a feminist. I was not anything. I wasn't young, but I remember saying I had came home and I was talking to my mother about it, and I said, you know what, Mother, I said that's interesting to me that they're gonna force people. They're gonna like put these covers on. They're gonna force people to be able to purchase stuff one way or another. And I said, you know what makes me fear that? And she said, what? I said, I believe that when we start to take people's choice away to be able to purchase what they want to purchase or do how they want to do, or to force to take people's liberties away in one way or the other, eventually we will live in a world where folk will lose all liberties, where folk will lose all rights, where folks will lose all choices. And I literally just thought about that again sitting here. Not that I want people to buy Playboy or anything else. My thing was, even as a really young person, was that if we allowed the government or any part of it to impose its whims on the people, we would eventually lose all kinds of rights. Like it would start with a little thing like a magazine, and it would be something that we could no longer control. And so that's the way I see this, being able to, people who don't necessarily feel like they have a dog in the fight for abortion, they feel as though they have no dog in this fight, period. They feel as though only people who are going to have abortions or whatever will lose any kind of rights, which they should lose them anyway, because we shouldn't be, whatever people say, shouldn't be happening. But what they don't understand is that when you allow yourself to start, when you allow the government to say it's okay to take one thing away from me, they will take liberty and take most and all things away. And then we will find ourselves in these kinds of positions. So I think I'm very disturbed. I think this is probably the most disturbing abortion law that I have, or abortion legislation that I have ever come across, because this abortion legislation I knew would have to be heard from this Supreme Court that this past administration handpicked. And I had absolutely no, thought or process that they would show up the way in which the Supreme Court should show up. Anyway, so that I was very fearful of what was going to happen. And if this law passed in Texas, what it would look like for the rest of the country, what it would look like just for the people who live in Texas. So I'm very disturbed by it, but while I'm very disturbed by it, I still have confidence that it'll win. But in order for it to win, more people are going to have to get on board. More people are going to have to be talking about what's happening. more people are going to have to show concern. More people are going to have to understand what we literally stand to lose when we allow these kinds of legislations to even go this far and to go forward. So that's kind of that's where I'm at with it. I don't want to say too much more because I know it will go into the questions that we're going to have later. But yeah, this is a very disturbing time for me and the work that we do and the people that we serve.
Thank you so much. Professor Gonzalez.
So I have to say, I don't feel like there's much I can add, right, at this stage to the conversation. I think it's literally to say, and this is, to pick up on one of the last points that Marcia was making, was that this isn't about one particular right. It's the entry point into really the attack on a full scope in how we might think about reproductive justice, but also sexual health, right? So it's the totality of all of those areas, and to not have clarity as to think from a legal perspective, and to use those fun words, the slippery slope, right? That we're sort of falling down, or perhaps into the sea of abyss in other ways, I think is where we have to have just such a laser-like focus at this stage, because especially the ways in which COVID then has also disrupted other areas around sexual health, around reproductive justice, that we're coming together into this perfect storm. And so there really has to be an acute awareness also about where law and policy are intersecting, and the signals that are being sent within one state, and how that's allowing other states to make a set of decisions about really essential levels of care.
Thank you. You've all, I think, really put this very powerfully and starkly about the moment that we're currently in. And I'm curious if some or all of you would like to talk a little bit about some of the historical and present day barriers to accessing abortion and other reproductive health care. And I do want to make sure that we get to the broader issues that you've all raised concerning more general barriers to reproductive justice. But one of the themes of the panel is to think about how people's intersecting identities of race, disability, gender identity, incarceration, immigration status amplify the kinds of barriers that we've seen historically and in the present day. So I was curious if some of you might want to speak to some of those historical and contemporary barriers.
So I'll just jump in and talk about some historical barriers. And I don't even have to go back very far. We'll just talk about the Hyde Amendment. Roe was passed. Well, so we'll go with Roe, because Roe was actually a barrier for many women, especially women that we serve. So like Roe didn't necessarily provide the access for abortions that needed to be provided. And so that in and of itself was a barrier, because there are so many folk who did not have access because they didn't have access. So access is nothing if you don't have access. So when you don't have the financial means, when those spaces are not even located in the places in which you live, if you don't know that it's available for you. So that was a barrier. And then of course, when we're looking at Hyde absolutely almost removed access to abortions for poor people and people who had to depend on government health care. So that's just been a barrier all along. I mean, it has just been a thing. And so economic access, those ways in which folk did not have the dollars, the monies to get it. The spiritual or religious community have been a barrier. And I think I'm talking as it relates to folk that we serve, because for the better part, we serve Black women and Black folk. And that religious community it holds a very stern kind of direct thing inside of our spaces that tend to kind of direct the decisions of whatever that we make. And so if it's coming from over the pulpit, historically, if it's coming from over the pulpit, then that's the direction in which many Black folk will go. Not all, but many. I can't speak for all. And so I think those are just those are some very clear areas right there, where we talk about historical barriers to abortions. Roe was a historical barrier to folk who did not have access. It was never accessible for all women and all folk. Um, the Hyde Amendment was definitely a barrier. And then religion have always held a strong point. And that kind of reaches inside of gender and how folk identify. And the fact that we just recently really started to talk about folk who don't show up in these spaces as women who will need to access abortions too, and what that would look like, and the denial of health care and expanded health care for all of us, the entire spectrum of who folks are. Those have been historical barriers to abortions. And in the end, I'll end it with this. I was walking this morning and I was talking with someone on my walk, and I was talking about how for so long abortion was so very womb centered, like just folk, it was just very, very narrowly centered. And it was just, am I going to have a baby or not going to have a baby? Am I a woman, or all these kinds of things? And so for too long, that was the center of abortions. And so we're now finally getting to a place where it is not just about that particular thing. It is much larger than that. And so we do talk about differently able folk, different folk who are not gendered in the same way, and all of these things. And it has to all be sitting on the table at the same time.
I think I would pivot us to a bit of a conversation that thinks about the ways in which white supremacy has absolutely and fully perpetrated the growth of our carceral system, right? And the incarceration of BIPOC people, but in particular, Black women, and how that legacy of racialized medical outcomes is being regularly and consistently still shaped, right? So we don't have to just think historically about the ways in which confinement has restricted reproductive justice access, and that ranges from a narrowly tailored issue like abortion or contraception, but to the totality of what the experiences are. I mean, it's not historical to say that in 2008 in California, we were still sterilizing women in California facilities, right? So that is our present day reality. And this has been a constant and regular battle. We shackle women still when they're giving childbirth, right? In the moments of confinement. And what we know from the data standpoint is that ultimately, women have been the fastest growing population of entering into incarceration since the 1980s. And when we then start to extrapolate that into 2019, what does that mean? That means that in particular for Black women, we're seeing at least a 14 to 17% differential in who is represented in that carceral setting. And all of those same policies that were deeply racialized, deeply gendered, right? And really were about the social control over Black bodies, but in particular Black women's bodies, are being replicated in those carceral systems. And even now in this COVID moment, while there's been a lot of attention on the ways in which COVID is a public health issue in the carceral system and how those are carceral health policies, there hasn't been a focus about how it impacts different bodies in different ways. So there's just a generalization about how we might think about COVID as a public health threat for individuals that are incarcerated, but we don't disaggregate that relative to the uniqueness of what it is to be a woman or be a person who identifies as female, right? I mean, that's the other aspect of this that is deeply layered, that in the face of COVID, the ability to get, access to gender affirming surgeries inside or outside of a carceral system, access to medication, that has all been limited in really significant ways. And so, how and where we talk about both abortion, but reproductive justice as a totality, we have to be really clear that in different public systems, the ways in which your body is being fully and consistently monitored, controlled, and just the autonomy is taken away from you is like phenomenal, but also does not land on bodies in the exact same way.
And to go off at that point too, you can kind of look at that the same way as like psychiatric facilities and the incarceration of people with various types of disabilities, and the ways in which they experienced forced or coerced abortions or sterilization, or the lack of the ability to make your own reproductive healthcare decisions, specifically thinking of guardianship laws, and things like that. And also, I think, thinking about state laws and policies that have really restricted this overall reproductive care, abortion access, and thinking about all of the pre-Roe bans that completely banned abortion before Roe, thinking about access to clinics and hospitals with these various trap laws that have been created, access to comprehensive sexual health education. Very limited. People don't understand their bodies. People don't understand their options. High rates of uninsurance, and this really stark line of not expanding access to care. And I think a lot of the other things I was going to say were touched on by the other panelists. So that's all I've got.
Thank you so much. I should have mentioned this earlier, but I think we have the opportunity for folks who are joining us virtually to put questions into the chat, and we will have a Q&A at the end of our time together. So please go ahead, and if questions occur to you, if you're watching from home, please feel free to put them in the chat. So we've been talking, I think, really broadly and richly about all of the different ways that barriers to reproductive justice have affected various communities, and as Professor Gonzalez said, affected them quite disparately. And we've also touched a little bit on the degree to which the pandemic has aggravated and amplified a lot of these concerns and barriers. I wanted to see if we could zoom in a little bit on Texas and SB8 for a moment. There's long been a push by state legislatures, now aggravated by the pandemic, but ongoing for many years now, to make it even harder for people to access abortions. And I was wondering if you all could talk about what's currently happening at the state level, how that particularly impacts marginalized communities, low-income people, and other folks who historically and in the present day lack access to care. I thought maybe Ms. Jones, as someone who's in Texas, you could maybe start on giving us a picture of what's going on now.
And so, yeah, so what's happening in Texas is almost catastrophic, right? It almost like overnight, it almost shut us down to being able to provide folk with access to abortions. I mean, like literally, we've not been an abortion fund for a long time, but even seeing folk who have been doing it a long time, just kind of like, where do we go here? But it definitely starts before now, because we found ourselves off and on in the same place in 2020 during COVID, where, our governor deemed that abortion clinics were not essential, and that they should not be open. And so we were in and out of court there. And so we kind of sort of saw what could happen, where we had folk who were presenting kind of late in gestation, and then they were in, they were out, they were in, they were out. And then some of them we lost, some of them we were able to get to a state where they could get an abortion. What makes this so different is that us getting them to get to a state where they can get an abortion could potentially cause some of us to have to close our doors, because if you get enough lawsuits in a small amount of time, you could literally lose your business. But bigger than losing the business or whatever, lose your doors being shut is the impact it is having on the people that we are forcing. So we're forcing people in a state. So we're forcing people, Black women, and I will continue to talk about Black folk because that's who we serve. We are forcing Black folk to have children in a state that have one of the worst CPS systems, right? And we have one of the highest rates of taking Black children from their families and putting them in CPS. So we're forcing these people to have these babies. We're forcing people to have babies in a state with one of the highest maternal mortality rate. So we're forcing people to go full term where they can potentially die, and children getting the babies, because we have a high maternal mortality rate too. We are forcing people to go full term in a state that refuses to expand Medicaid and Medicaid on any level, that also refuses to expand Medicaid long enough so that we could decrease maternal mortality for this same group of folks. We are forcing people to know that they're pregnant early enough to even get an abortion, if to even get to the clinic in a state that still requires more than one trip to the abortion clinic, that will not do comprehensive sex ed, so folks don't have a really good comprehensive understanding of their bodies and how it works. So all of this stuff is happening. And then for the women who we typically serve at the appeal center, they usually are late. I mean, they're late in gestation anyway. We rarely ever get anybody under 13 weeks of gestation. So it's the late gestation. And then they come to the appeal center with zero. So we are a practical support fund, but we usually have to provide monies for the abortion, because no matter how much people get pledged, they said when you come with zero, zero is still zero. So it creates economic hardship for people. The more unintended pregnancies that non-white folk have, that's the more that it assures generational poverty, right? So we're forcing people into poverty when we're forcing people to carry. Then when you're looking at folk living with HIV, and we have to always make sure that that is a part of our conversation, because we serve these people. You can also, now we're talking about criminalizing, because in the state of Texas, where we don't have any direct HIV criminalization laws, we do have laws that criminalize folk who have sex, who are living with HIV. So someone gets pregnant, that person, if they get pregnant by, may want to force them in a relationship by saying, if you leave, I will now prosecute you for exposing me to HIV. And so you have that situation. And for folks living with HIV, will 6 weeks even be enough time, especially if they are in like the public healthcare system, where they have to get all of these appointments before they even know if they're pregnant. So it is a wide range of stuff that happens in a state like Texas. We are constantly removing protections in healthcare for trans folk, but yet we will force trans folk to carry if that is not a desire of theirs, without the mental health care in place to make sure that they go through that healthy. So many ways in which what's happening in Texas is impacting folks in Texas. We're not even really, it's so much. We don't even hear a lot about it. We rarely hear about folk living with HIV. We rarely hear about what happens when you force folk to carry who should not be carrying anyway. We don't understand it, but rape, molestation, and don't have a care system in place, mental, physical, or any kind of way to take care of this, the economic income, all of these things that is happening at the same time. It is intersectionality at its best. All of these opposing oppressions happening at the same time with such a devastating impact. So it is just so much larger. And at the same time, we have had to deal with these voter suppression laws in Texas that impact these same folk. So the fight is so great for us here. I'm not even sure if people, Texas is a thing in and of itself. I love it. I'll never leave. Maybe I like torture. I don't know. It is a fight. It is a fight. And we get the opportunity and we get the pleasure at the Affair Center to serve folk who rarely are heard or seen, for many of the reasons that Thalia and Israel have already said that I didn't say. For those reasons, where Black voices are not heard and Black bodies are not seen and not valued. And many times this particular, we don't even feel like there is a fight for us in this fight. And so it make it harder, but it's definitely worth it. But it is a huge fight that we're fighting in Texas. And it can be a lot, but we can't give up. We have to still fight, and we have to figure out ways. And the last thing is, when you start talking about criminalizing something, and you're talking about people who have historically been criminalized the most, that is automatically going to make them not come to seek that service, because you're talking about criminalizing a group of people who are already overly criminalized. So when you start talking about criminalization, you really think they're going to come and they're going to come and receive those services that could potentially be criminalized? So it is just really interesting, this work that we're doing here and why we have to do it. And that I just think the world needs to really know the impact of this and how it's going to impact the rest of the United States, especially the South in Texas.
Thank you so much. That's a really powerful account of Texas specifically, and well, I certainly take your point about Texas being ground zero for a lot of this. I also understand you to be saying that this is not something that's confined to Texas. And Ms. Cook, I was wondering if you, I know you've done work in various states, if you could tell us a little bit about how you see this playing out elsewhere in the United States. And I also know you've worked specifically with people who are living with disabilities and are already in a very compromised situation prior to the pandemic, that the pandemic has aggravated in various ways. So I'm curious if you could talk a bit about whether and in what ways access has worsened as a result of the pandemic. Are there any hopeful prospects for example, increased access to telehealth, or are we really talking about a widespread sort of downward spiral in all of these areas?
Thank you. So I'll try to start with that question. And one, thank you, Marcia. That was just a beautiful perspective. And I'm going to go a little bit more macro and general state level. So there were over 50 restrictive bills, close to 60 restrictive abortion bills passed in 2021. It was one of the worst legislative years for abortion in history. There was over 400, close to 500 bills, restrictive abortion bills that were introduced in the state legislators. And in 2020, at the beginning of the pandemic, states really used executive orders to limit abortion access, like Marcia was talking about. And they used it in some states, when people were not willing or not able to come to state legislators to provide testimony or protest against a bill. They used the COVID pandemic to pass bills in secret. I'm thinking of Tennessee that passed that huge anti-abortion omnibus late at night. No one was present. No one knew what was happening. So it's really harmful for advocates, specifically those with different pre-existing conditions or caregivers or people with children. A lot of states required advocates to come to hearings in person. They closed state buildings where hearings were held or limited those who could be in attendance. A lot of state legislators and personnel weren't wearing masks in the legislative buildings. And they limited or had no virtual testimony opportunities. And that really came back strong in 2021, and many states really came back strong trying to pass anti-abortion legislation. Specifically, there were 18 trigger bans for abortion introduced in 2021. 2 were enacted, of course, in Texas and Oklahoma. And you see many states like Arkansas that are trying to they have a total ban that's enjoined by the court. You have Oklahoma that has essentially a total ban that's currently enjoined by the court. So there's some really awful abortion restrictions that have been enacted. Luckily, a lot of them have been enjoined by the court, other than Texas SB8. And I think, too, on the point of Texas SB8, there's so many states coming out saying that they want to introduce copycats. I mean, Florida's already introduced one. Arkansas is like gung-ho about introducing a copycat in a special session or in the next legislative session. So really thinking about that, you know, very, very, very scary. And I think related to the access of people with disabilities to abortion, I mean, there are so many barriers already. And the pandemic really like amplified those barriers, like your access to essential services, because you know, you had limited doctor's visits. People can't go into hospitals and clinics. People can't get transportation to and from their appointments. So there was a ton of barriers that were just amplified. And then thinking about telehealth, telehealth was expanded in a lot of states in relation to the pandemic, but in relation to abortion, many states wanted to restrict how people access abortion through telehealth. And so while there is hope that other services can be accessed through telehealth, states are really trying to double down on limiting the access of telehealth for abortion provisions. And I won't get into like the federal REMS and things like that. That can be a different conversation, but I think I answered the question. Hopefully, there are a lot of parts.
Thank you so much. So that was a very multi-part question. I really appreciate all of your really enlightening answers. So I want to pursue one of the themes that that you just mentioned about what's happening in various state legislatures and looking ahead to potential outcomes in that regard. But before we leave the topic of the pandemic and how that's affected reproductive health care, but also more generally issues related to reproductive justice, Professor Gonzalez, I was wondering if you could tell us, and I know you've already begun to do this, to tell us a bit about some of the other ways that the pandemic has impacted people's ability to raise families more generally, you know, which of course includes reproductive health care, but also includes a lot of other factors in their lives.
Sure. I think it'll be really bridging. I'll talk about 3 areas in particular, but I also want to bridge things that both Marcia and Israel said, which was first to Marcia's point about, you know, the replication of a cycle of poverty, right? So each of the areas I'll talk about are all feeding into this question of economic justice in relationship to how we talk about reproductive justice and sexual health, for example. And that they can't be isolated from each other. So what is that co-influential nature? And then how do they map against the social determinants of health, right? We haven't sort of exposed a bigger conversation about why this is a public health crisis, not just COVID itself, but that we're facing a pandemic of a whole host of crises that ultimately are about the ways in which health and public health is being implicated. But more importantly, how laws either serve health affirming functions or health harming functions, right? So every time we talk about abortion laws, we're talking about law as its own determinant of health, the ways in which it either is going to influence in a positive or negative, right, mitigate or exacerbate health inequities. And so at the end of the day, the totality of our conversation is about racialized and gendered ways in which disparities not just exist, but perpetuate far beyond what the pandemic is, but also before the pandemic existed. So if we don't have a health justice framework for understanding how and where we need to start to dismantle laws and or reaffirm laws that actually are health affirming and do promote health in that way, then I think we also lose something. And so this is where Israel's comment about amplified barriers to essential services are so critical, because we can think about the way in which the pandemic and COVID in particular has taken away access to essential services in an area such as contraceptions. And I mean that also just in a very basic way, in that we've had such an incredible disruption to supply chains and the reallocation of what health resources look like, that the access to contraception and the ways then you get to make decisions about your reproductive autonomy, it does not look the same as it did pre-COVID. And that doesn't mean to say that pre-COVID we were in a utopia and it was a wonderful environment, right? I think that Marcia has really illuminated what that means on the ground in a deeply lived experience way, but just that our healthcare system was simply unable to cope with, right, what it meant to have a pandemic come into play. And so those essential services, avoiding an unintended pregnancy, which then has an impact on your health and your life and how you might want to choose to raise a family, has come into that sort of contact in that way. And that's also true to thinking about limiting an in-person visit, right? What is the difficulty in scheduling an IUD installation or a hormonal implant? That's not something that you can do via telehealth, even if you have access to telehealth, which is that's another layer of economic injustice, right? Who actually does have access to healthcare through a telehealth system? And what does that look like? I mean, I think even in the sense of myself, and I consider myself to be a privileged person in the context of what my life is, trying to get a doctor's visit for my daughter via telehealth, it was a 2 to 3 week waiting period. And so, it's that moment of how and where then, if I'm navigating in that way with the privilege that I have sitting with my positionality, how do we even think about the compounding marginalization when we put all of those layers of subordination and anti-Blackness in particular into perspective? So I would land on this point about essential services such as contraceptions. I think we can't have this conversation also not talking about maternal health. We know that in the context of maternal health and just who bears the burden and the dire circumstances of death, right? And maternal mortality that falls on the shoulders of Black women, both historically and contemporaneously. These are not old issues. They have not been mitigated. And so the consequences of COVID means that when we're thinking about maternal health, it's not just about the ability to give birth. It's also about what is your mental health needs. We know the allostatic load on Black people is beyond the capacity in which most bodies can function. And it's a phenomenal moment of resilience that Black communities have been able to function with that level of allostatic load, the trauma from racism in and of itself, but then the trauma of being consistently policed, right? The trauma of not having access to healthcare, the trauma of not having access to food security, all the things that we know, and that law controls every single one of those. Our scaffolding is set up in that way. But how we want to then think about what is maternal health and what are we providing from a maternal health standpoint. It also has meant that, as the pandemic has progressed, many people have thought about giving at-home births. And for those with higher risk pregnancies or concerns, that's a less viable option. And so then how do you actually navigate that changing landscape of healthcare services with reduced resources? NPR did an evaluation several weeks ago thinking about the District of Columbia in particular, and the way in which a particular Black woman was literally bounced from 4 different hospitals because they were closing services due to COVID-related issues and that there was not access to physicians. And she was simply just trying to get the basic level of maternal health care. And then you layer that on with a level of mental health concerns relative to just navigating the system. But then what is it to be existing in the context of the pandemic? And then where and how is the trauma of your experience with the pandemic, your familial experience with the pandemic, and from a community standpoint, the experience of the pandemic? And we have not paid clear attention to that. And the last place that I would elevate is something that, at Georgetown and the Center on Poverty and Equality, and in particular the initiative on gender justice, we're thinking a lot about, which is how the care economy has gone underground. So we've always known that disproportionately Black, Latina, and Indigenous women have served the care economy in a pretty significant way, and that the wealth gap between Black and white families has meant that the care economy has really hit Black women in such a disproportionate context. But at the end of the day, it's no longer just women who have women who are, say, the age of maturation post 18. What we've noticed over this last year with schools closing, and this is where it becomes underground, is that so many girls of color have taken on the roles in the caregiving economy, which has taken them out of a school context, whether that be in person or Zoom, or they're coming to school after caring for others within the context of their family that might be siblings that might be aging adults, right? And so how and where that's now influencing both when we think about education as a social determinant, but also poverty. So it goes back to that point of what is this constant cycle? Because both of those, education and poverty as social determinants of health, are feeders straight into our carceral system and into mass incarceration. And so when a young person is not coming to school or is marked as absent and truant, police officers, even in the Zoom context, are being sent to homes, right? There's a whole range of ways we get this movement very quickly in that context. And so we have to put, again, all of this within this bigger framework of how do we think about public health? How do we think about the role of public health law and health lawyers in conversation and in connection with the rest of what the movement looks like? Because none of us can do this in isolation. And so each of those three examples I gave really do take a much more holistic effort. But an effort that's about dismantling these barriers around law, because that's what we're really facing in these times. So COVID has given us insight, shall we say, into what has already existed for decades and decades, but perhaps gives us some new opportunities to think about starting to really dismantle what that moment of anti-Blackness is in manifesting in the totality of both our economy, but what it means to think about what health and resilience and well-being is.
Thank you so much. That was incredibly both moving and illuminating. And after all that you've said and how each of you has illuminated all of these intersections and broader frames that we really need to grapple with in order to think about abortion access specifically. I'm even a little hesitant to zoom us back into abortion access, but I'm going to do it anyway, and just ask you, each of you perhaps to reflect upon the future in this area, both maybe the immediate future and the long-term future. And I was struck by something that Professor Gonzalez said about the possibility for more health-affirming laws and justice-affirming laws. And so on the one hand, from what all of you have said, we recognize the tremendous barriers and how they have multiplied and compounded over time. I'm curious to hear if you have sort of stories of hope or thoughts about what the future looks like from an advocate's perspective, both in the context of abortion access and more broadly. But first, sort of the negative question, which is if, as I think many of us expect, either Roe is explicitly overturned or perhaps more likely just continue to be eroded in ways that are that it's already been, for some people, as you've mentioned, never particularly effective, but has already been eroded over many decades now. In the event that occurs, I'm wondering if you can talk about what the fallout would look like for abortion access from each of your perspectives as advocates at various levels of this system.
I can go ahead and set the bleak stage on the state level policy. So yeah, without the constitutionally protected right to access abortion, large parts of the South and the Midwest and pretty much most of the country is poised to eliminate abortion access entirely. I think, according to one of our kind of reports, it's called What If Roe Fell. You can see it on the center's website, which gives like a really great breakdown of state laws that are enjoined or have been passed and what state laws or the state access to abortion would look like if Roe fell. You can see that there. But around 24 states would likely take action to prohibit abortion outright. 12 12 states, including Mississippi and Texas, have trigger laws that are designed to ban abortion immediately if the right to abortion is no longer constitutionally protected. The rollout of those could depend on the language in the legislation, but that could happen. And many states have pre-Roe bans, so bans that are still abortion bans that are currently unconstitutional, but haven't been amended. So those could potentially go into effect if Roe fell. And then I would like to reference another kind of interactive map from Guttmacher that shows travel distance for abortion access, that like total driving distance and travel distance. If the Mississippi case, if the 15-week ban or 6-week ban is upheld, and if Texas SB8 is upheld, or if Roe falls entirely. So again, Roe is a floor that doesn't ensure access. Many people in the South and the Midwest do not have access to abortion, regardless of the status of Roe. So, you know, a lot of people are still living in a post-Roe, you know, society. But yeah, that's kind of the bleak, the bleak landscape.
So if I can jump in, because I really love the way Dr. Thalia wraps this up every time we talk. It's funny. I've never had the highest expectation for this, right? So there's not a low place for me to fall with, because I've never had a really high expectation. I sit in these spaces a lot. It's more now than I ever have. Usually when abortion stuff happens in Texas around abortion, people will usually talk to me once or twice. I usually get 2 shots on the news or whatever, because what happens is when they start talking to me, I start talking about all of the other things that happens inside of the lives of the women that we serve. And that's not very romantic. That's not very fun. Like people only want to hear about abortion. They don't want to hear about people being hungry, children being hungry, folks dying on the streets, not having access. And so when I started talking about economic justice, environmental justice, and all this stuff, people's like, oh, okay, we don't want to talk to her anymore. We want to have the other conversation. And so because I don't have the luxury to just think about abortions, even though abortions are horrific, I sit here and I think, and I was thinking about Dr. Thalia when you were saying all of this stuff about health laws, about the connection with the social determinants of health and all of these things. And I think how long I've been doing this work. And I started out with HIV. And way back in the day, I was saying, y'all, this is not about behavior. This is not about this. It is about these other things. People didn't want to hear it. And so now abortion is happening, and it's all, and people are just like screaming, they're giving me all the money, they're doing all the stuff. I'm not getting all the money, y'all, be sure. We still Black in Texas, we ain't getting all the money. And people are doing all of this stuff, but you know what? People are still not asking me, so what's gonna happen with the women who's gonna be forced to have children, maternal mortality rates? What are the maternal rates gonna go up? What's gonna happen with the people, they have these children and they already had health conditions prior to getting pregnant, perhaps that's why they're getting an abortion. What's gonna happen to them? I'm not getting any questions around how are we going to continue to take care of folks and make sure that we're working to decrease maternal mortality. Nobody's asking me anything about folks living with HIV. Nobody's asking that question. What's going to happen? You know, what about women who are living with HIV, who potentially may want to get pregnant or don't want to get pregnant and then want to have an abortion? How is stigma going to impact their lives? How is it going to impact them? What's going to happen to folks who are still getting killed, you know, in our communities when we're looking at the rate in which Black folk are getting killed? Nobody's asking me that. Nobody's asking me about the adultification of Black girls that lead them very quickly into the prison industrial complex. And nobody's asking that. Nobody's asking about the Black girls who are dropping out of school because they're having their periods and they're ashamed to go back to school because they're messing up their clothes because they're being forced to wear uniforms. Somebody's asking me that. So sometimes I have a hard time when I sit in these spaces because I don't have the luxury of just waking up. I didn't have the luxury on September the 2nd to wake up and say, oh my God, we cannot provide people with abortions. I had to say that, and I had to also make sure we were serving people living with HIV. We had to also make sure we were feeding people on the street who are still displaced because of COVID and the power grid in Texas. All of these things are happening in my life at the same time. we are literally at the affairs center of the people that we serve. So I don't have the luxury of seeing what's going to happen next if we don't have access to abortion. Because I'm going to still see those same women forced to carry, forced to face their mortality, and just deciding that they're going to carry a child, not knowing what to do. But I do believe that we've learned since Roe. I do believe that there won't be this whole thing around. I believe that women are going to do what they've always done. They're going to take care of their reproductive needs, and they're going to take care of their reproductive choices, and they're going to take care of them in the best way that they know how to take care of them. And what we're going to have to do is make sure they do it in a way that is safe enough that if they do decide to have a child again, that they will be able to do that, and there will not be so much damage happen. But that's my reality of what I've just said. I just don't have the luxury of thinking about what happens. And I'm sure that's not what y'all invited me for. I'm sorry. I don't have the luxury of thinking about what happens if we should lose Roe. Because I know if we lose it, the folk that I serve, their life is going to be a whole cluster, that word. That's what it's going to be. Because it's already that way with limited access to. And it's not even access, it's limited knowledge. Because we have these conversations and we don't even talk to the people who need it the most. Because I can still leave here and talk to people who don't even know that Senate Bill 8 is happening and it impacts them. So that's me. That's where I am with it. And I'm looking for you, Dr. Dahlia, to give me the wraparound with all of this. So I'm a wonky kind of. I love to hear the doctors and the people who do this work and the professors talk about it, because this is the way I bring it to the table. But you all give me the data that I need, and I get to be lazy and just get to write stuff. But no, I really want to hear how do we really wrangle this, because that's the reality of us and the way we do the work here in Texas.
Well, I think you opened up the door to the second question, right? That was posed to all of us, which is what does the future look like from an advocate's perspective? I mean, to me, the future is that one, and I speak now to law students, right? Or to those in the audience that are moving into this work, is that without an intersectional lens, all the work that you're thinking about doing to tackle inequities and injustice is just likely to end up perpetuating a system inequality. And maybe that's not what you want to hear, right? But to the extent, when we talk about reproductive justice, we talk about reproductive health, it is exactly as Marcia explains it. It is not a catch-all category. It is not something that is singularly defined. It is about a way in which there's a relationship to power. And the way a Black woman experiences misogyny and racism is fundamentally different than the way a white woman experiences misogyny and racism, and the way that a Latina, experiences misogyny and racism, and the way a Black man experiences racism, right, and patriarchy. I mean, it's just the clarity that we must have is so central to this. And what that means is there is actually a space in place within the movement for all of these different areas of work. Because it isn't just about saying, well, if Roe falls, oh my God, what do we do, right? Is it about is it about attacking that moment of dismantling Roe? For some of you, the answer is probably yes. But for many of you, the answer I would invite, and quite frankly, Marcia invited you much more than I can do, quite frankly, right, is to say, where do I fit in this continuum? If the continuum is about power, if the continuum is about how we think about oppression, if the continuum is about racism as a root cause of not just all of our systemic inequities, but very deeply the way in which health disparities exist. And health policy is all policy, right? If COVID has not taught us that health policy is all policy, then I invite you to reflect a little bit about what that means. And so this is that place of advocacy. Perhaps you are someone who deeply wants to think about the ways in which girls experience schools, right? To the point about adultification and, and that the work that we did at the center that really has catalyzed this space to finally put that in the centrality of our space, of the ways in which we move and talk about this work, right? So that your concern is not just, how are, girls coming in contact with police in schools and therefore dropping out? They are, one, being pushed out, but then two, in being pushed out, what does that then mean as they start to move through the rest of the world, right? And the rest of their lived experiences, and how and where is that coming in context? That might be because then of an issue about their reproductive health and their sexual health, but that could very much just as easily be an issue of how and where are they then moving straight into our system of mass incarceration? And how and where are they then disproportionately bearing a burden within an underground economy of care? And then we could even talk more about an underground economy of sex work, right? All of these things that we know are literally falling on the shoulders of Black girls and Black women in particular. And then as we expand those categories, we can think about women of color more broadly, right? But that's where you can be in this continuum. I teach a class that literally is about mass incarceration, and we never get to mass incarceration at the end because all we look at is all the ways you get into that cycle and how all those ways are controlled by law. And all those ways are also about policing Black bodies. And so, whether you're talking about poverty, whether you're talking about healthcare access, whether you're talking about policing, whether you're talking about schools, it pushes us, right? It pushes us into this place of a continued moment of social control. So yes, if Roe falls, it will be a moment, a very landmark moment within the context of many people's lives, and especially within the context of many lawyers' lives. I don't think anyone's suggesting that's not true. But where we then need to turn our attention is, if in a reality without Roe, what are all of the other things that we might have previously missed, or now are so acute that we have the opportunity to now play in that? And that could be from a policy standpoint. That could be from an organizing standpoint. That could be from a direct services standpoint. That could be because academics are providing free, accessible, high quality research, right? I mean, this is where pushing the philanthropic communities to make sure that research does not get siloed in that thing called Westlaw you have to pay for, or in those peer-reviewed journals that people don't necessarily want/need access to, right? It's the totality about what does equity truly look like, and how and where, from an equity lens, from a justice lens, are we, and from a deeply anti-Blackness lens, are we able to then say Roe is an opportunity? It's not the opportunity we necessarily wanted, but is it an opportunity for us to unpack all of the things that Marcia just told you about? All of the moments that are the lived experience on the ground that we need to have clarity about. And then you step back and say, but you know what? I'm not sure I'm ready for that. But what Israel just told me is something I'm interested in working on. So that's where you pivot your attention. It is that landscape that we now get. And that is where we come back to, again, my point about power. This is literally about the relationship with power. And as lawyers and future attorneys, the ways in which you get to define how and where the relationship power is that you have with yourself, with your clients, with the system, that's your opportunity. And that, when we think about this panel and even in this week of public interest, is what you should be thinking about. So Marcia, I doubt I did you justice, but you threw it in my court, so I tried.
That was absolutely beautifully done, and I can't tell you how much I have appreciated, I know all of us have appreciated all of your insights and perspectives. I think we have a few minutes left for questions, and I'm going to, with great thanks and gratitude, turn it over to our student leaders to manage the question and answer period. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you so much to Professor Mary. And I know that the panelists can't see the room right now, but I do want to let you know we have at least 100 people sitting here. The room is actually an overflow and everyone is very attentive to what you're saying. So thank you so much for everything. The second CLE passcode, before I forget, by the way, is Nacho. So if you're receiving CLE credit, please put that in now. So we only have about 5 minutes left. I'm just gonna ask a quick question that someone sent in earlier. If the panelists could just touch on it very quickly. I'm sorry that we won't get to most of your questions, but Professor Gonzalez, you actually mostly touched on this earlier, but a panelist just wanted to know what lawyers and students could do to keep intersectional frameworks in mind in the work that they do, and beyond lawyers, people in general, like what can the people in attendance today be doing in their everyday lives to further the goals of reproductive justice, whether that's donating, organizing, advocacy. If you could just say in now 4 minutes or less, but very quickly, sorry.
I can just say real quickly, I think centering the people that are most affected. I don't know if anyone listened to the oral arguments this morning, but abortion was rarely mentioned. The pregnant people impacted, rarely mentioned. So like when you are doing this work, you need to be talking about the pregnant people. You need to be talking about the people most impacted. You need to be addressing the stigma head on, and really centering the affected people. That's, I think that's one of the biggest takeaways, especially as a lawyer listening to the oral arguments this morning. Like, what are we here for, to talk about random procedural things, when are we getting to the issue that people are negatively impacted by this law?
Great. Marcia, Professor Gonzalez, would you like to weigh in, or we can end there if it was powerful too? Great. I mean, you've all presented an incredibly comprehensive panel today. There wasn't very much to add. Thank you so much. Could everyone please just give a round of applause? Thank you so much for coming. Lunch is being served outside, and everyone have a great day.
Also, let's give a round of applause to IFWIN, HAL, NALSA, and ACS for putting together a wonderful event. Thanks, everyone.
Hey, how are you?
I'm gonna thank you for